We'll start. My name is Ali Asani. I'm the director of the Alwaleed Islamic Studies program, which is delighted to host this event in collaboration with the South Asia Institute here. This event is actually part of a series that we jointly sponsor on Muslim societies in South Asia. And today's event is a particularly special event for me because of the scholar who's going to talk to us today. Professor Ayesha Jalal is somebody whose work I admire tremendously and whose work has also had a tremendous impact on my own work. And she's been, through the ages, been a very good friend and colleague. And so I've been very excited to see the publication of this new book, The Struggle for Pakistan. And it really represents decades of work and thinking about different aspects of Pakistani history, not just from archival sources, because Ayesha, to her credit, is somebody who's also interested in literature and uses literary text to provide pictures of society. I'm not going to say much more about Ayesha because she's well known. She is currently Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts, where she has a joint appointment with the History Department and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Ayesha has, of course, very strong roots in the Boston area. She studied at Wellesley, where she went undergraduate, and then went to Cambridge University of Cambridge in England, where she got her PhD. She was associated with Cambridge for several years, and then eventually was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C., and then had teaching stints in various institutions, including Harvard. I remember the semester that she taught at Harvard. Her courses were really well subscribed and very popular. And so with that, it's really wonderful to be able to welcome Ayesha back to Harvard. The format of today's event is that Professor Jalal will speak for a few minutes. I guess as the spirit moves you can. And then after that, Atiya Khan, who is the South Asia Institute Aman Fellow, will engage. We'll ask some questions and comments on the book. And then after that, we will open up for question answer. Just a reminder that because this event is being recorded, because eventually it will be shared on the website, when you do ask questions, there is a mic that will be going around the room. Nora will have a mic. So do wait for the mic before you ask your question so that your question can be recorded. All right? Okay. So before I hand over to Ayesha, I will introduce Atiya, who...
Something's going on here.
Something's...
Okay. Nora, sorry, we need you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
All right. Okay. So Atiya, as I said, is the Harvard South Asia Institute Aman Fellow. She's a historian of modern South Asia, and her first project recovers the untold story of progressive politics in Pakistan, from the consolidation of the efforts to carve a Muslim majority state out of British India in 1940 until the fracture of that state with the Bangladesh War in 1971. Her research interests are broad: decolonization in South Asia, difficulties of democracy and development in post-colonial South Asia and the Muslim world, and the history of international New Left social movements. So with that, I will turn over to Ayesha. So,
thank you so much, Ali. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming on a rainy day. Now, I have a few talking points. I would like to focus on interchange with you and your questions that you might have, not necessarily related to what I say, but I'll be open to answering questions on Pakistan generally and the region. But I do want to start by asking, why did I write the book? I think this is a book that's been in the offing for a long, long time. It was expected of me. I think I write books because I want to, but this book I can say without doubt was on demand. I was expected to write it, so I did eventually, but I took 21 years before I turned to it. And I think in the meantime I looked at other things. I was more interested in intellectual scholarly works. I wrote monographs. And so this is a general book. I mean, if those who think this is a monograph, you'd be sadly disappointed. This is meant to be a general book. And I wrote it because of the present turn in scholarship on Pakistan. And it was really, there was a need for a work of historical interpretation that was attentive to key shifts in both domestically and regionally, and not to mention international levels. Key shifts have taken place. Where does Pakistan belong? And I think really the presumption on the part of some ill-informed people, whether out of prejudice or simple ignorance, is that the fact that this country is seen to have been created in the name of religion, the fact that its birth was marked by bloodshed, people believe, some of them, that, well, I mean, what's happening today was just inevitable. Well, you know, inevitable is a word that historians dislike intensely because that puts them out of work, for one thing. There is no such thing as inevitability in history. It is all human agency and human contingency is what people decide to do, which is why it really is important to understand some of the key turning points in this country's history, which is all, I mean, you know, it's reduced to facile descriptions, failed state, failing state, whatever you like, but all negative mainly, without regard for either context or content. I might add that the recent narrative coming out of India, or at least a section of India, is that Pakistan was a mistake, a failed state, and an irrelevant state. So I'd like to contest those sorts of narratives and talk about some of the key shifts that have happened. Now, let me just say that this book is something that I always believed I would have to write. I just avoided it for a long, long time. After writing my first book, The Sole Spokesman, I did want to write on the post-colonial transition and ended up writing The State of Martial Rule on the first decade, only because I thought that the first decade was so crucial in Pakistan's otherwise rather sad history or attempts to create a democracy. Since then, I turned on to other projects, as some of you will know, and really it's only in recent times that I have felt that I mean, not only because I was pressed by editors, but by my editor to write this book, but also I felt finally, after I finished the Pity of Partition, that the time had come to make an intervention, not only because I felt that Pakistan had reached a stage in its politics where there was a possibility to perhaps say goodbye, make a final break with the state of martial rule. Which is what I call Pakistani state. The Pakistani state is the state of martial rule. It's ruled by the military. It may not be martial law, but the military calls the shots. We know that. But I do think that this was the moment, and it is extremely important to remind Pakistanis who are in a state of acute depression that there is something that they have to see positive. You know, half the problem is how you approach the question. And if I was to just talk to you about terrorism and bloodshed, then that's what will come out. But if I talk to you about other things, maybe there is a better perspective on this country's future. So I'm not going to try and summarize a very long, I mean, it's quite a long book, but I would like to sort of point out some key themes, just for the sake of discussion. There's a lot there. And for those who might have looked at it already, I'd be happy to answer questions. But this is what I've chosen. Why was Pakistan created? The usual commonsensical, common knowledge is for religion. It was meant to provide a homeland for India's Muslims, and that is the end of the story. Religion is meant to be the main impetus behind the creation of Pakistan. I mean, the historical evidence, I'm really sorry to say to Pakistanis, is really militates against this certitude. And I mean, if their claim to nationhood was conceded, Indian Muslims ended up being split initially in 47 between two separate nation states, India and Pakistan, and then after 71, into three. So what kind of a solution is this? Where is the regional dimension to this interpretation of partition, or why Pakistan was created? And I think this is the great fallacy that has persisted in interpretations of Pakistan, the insistence on seeing everything as a result of this religious impulse. And I think that we need to certainly talk about the religious impulse, but we need to know what we are talking about. And I really would like to sort of put that straight out. But I do want to point out that, you know, prior to the creation of the country, I mean, and I want to read some parts of the book to share with you to give you a sense of what is in there. And really one of the more memorable contemporary recollections of Muhammad Ali Jinnah on the eve of partition, Beverly Nichols had described the lanky and stylishly dressed barrister as the most important man in Asia. As long as Jinnah was around, nothing disastrous was likely to happen, Nichols quipped. So a great deal hangs on the grey silk cord of that monocle. Now, Jinnah's death in September of 1948 was a blow to Pakistan, but cannot explain why Pakistan came to be ruled less by an ideology, and that to an ideology of religion, than by an institution. The military's rise to dominance in Pakistan's history occurred as early as really the early 1950s. I mean, I would say as early as 1951 with the assassination of Pakistan's first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan. And really cannot be understood without accounting for the context of regional and global challenges of the Cold War. It has to be seen in the context of the Cold War. How was the dominance of this non-elected institution registered so early? Well, the answer to that all-important question has to be found in the regional rivalries with India, not to mention the Kashmir dispute, and of course, ultimately, the international imperatives of Cold War politics. Pakistan's domestic dilemmas have owed less to the intrinsic cultural diversities of its people, as is often suggested, that it is really a problem of the fact that Pakistan is an artificial state. I think that can be, but I think that the more important question, I think, is the ways in which institutional imbalances, and those too of colonial institutions, now post-colonial institutions, have really exacerbated the federal equation in Pakistan. The repeated interventions in Pakistan's history have done that. So there's a lot in there about the early period, and I'm not going to repeat that, but I will talk about what is my interpretation of the 1971 tragedy. I mean, there are those who blame this man, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. But I have benefited here. You know, I'm happy to answer questions about archives, but in this particular instance, I did benefit from hitherto unused documents, which you'll find references in the book. And I'd like to just sort of share some parts of this argument here. On a visit to Dhaka, in the late summer of 1968, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto declared Bengali demands for provincial autonomy to be in the best interests of the country. He criticized the CSP, the civil bureaucrats of Pakistan, for treating the people of the Eastern Wing as Kala Admis, literally black men, and that derogatory attitude had misled the government into implicating Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in the Agartala conspiracy case when they ought to have been negotiating with him. Bhutto claimed that with the exception of 2 of the 6 points of provincial autonomy that the Awami League had unfurled, he was really agreeable to all of them. And he was prepared to dialogue with the Awami League leader. And so he said, I mean, you know, his whole point was, at least at this stage, that the government had to find political solutions to the problem, as, quote, such issues cannot be solved by force. And yet, 3 years later, Bhutto was as implicated as the military regime itself in the bloodbath that had been unleashed by the military high command in Pakistan. And the question, of course, there are many views on the matter. There are those who blame Bhutto and his insatiable appetite for power. But really the evidence that I suggest, I mean, first of all, I want to make 2 points. One is that this is almost a sort of a mirror image in a sense of 47. Just as in 47, I've argued that it was a question of power sharing, a power sharing arrangement that eluded Indians and resulted in the creation of Pakistan. 1971 was also a question of power sharing. Here, the majority, the Bengali majority, was entitled to be allowed to run the country. But this was unacceptable to a country where the military and the bureaucracy, dominated by Punjab, had come to call the shots. They were not prepared to let them happen. So, I mean, the notion that Bhutto, I mean, he was certainly an ambitious man, was entirely responsible for this problem. His political brinkmanship led Pakistan. I mean, this is widely believed in Pakistan that it was really Bhutto. And of course, Mr. Bhutto would have been, I mean, he has to be sort of criticized for becoming an instrument or a pawn, if you like, in the military's game. But he really didn't have the clout to determine whether or not the military went into action. And what we find instead is that not only was this tragedy foretold in the attitudes of the military-dominated state of Pakistan towards regionalism, towards regional demands, but what is more, that contrary to the view that the negotiations failed, the negotiations never failed. They were simply I mean, the army intervened on its own. There was no failure of the breakdown of negotiations. They were abruptly cut off by the military intervention. So here again, I mean, you know, the point here is that the Bengali, I mean, if you talk to Bangladeshis of the period who were close to Sheikh Mujib, they will tell you that they never intended to quit. They intended to claim their power. I mean, they had every right to do so, and it was the military action that sort of prevented a resolution. So I think this is something that Pakistanis need to think about, debate, and it should go a long way in a very major period in their history in terms of what happened. Of course, Bhutto is to blame because the Mahmud Rahman Commission lay gathering dust on his desk, and other desks I knew also had that, and I couldn't read it, but I do remember that was the volume that ought to have been put out. It's a commission's report on the 1971 debacle, which Bhutto protected. I mean, he protected the army from, because it's really a very damning document, of which chunks have been printed, but some chunks have not. And I think that should have been put out. But Bhutto did not want to take on the army. He thought that he had the opportunity at this stage. But what were the key elements of Mr. Bhutto's foreign policy? I mean, here's a nation divided, I mean, split, demoralized. And so it was Mr. Bhutto's real struggle to revive the fortunes of this country. And what did he do first and foremost? What were the most important? He was always a proponent of independent foreign policy. The Myth of Independence, his book, he was a great advocate of China, the China policy. I might add that he was the architect of Pakistan's China policy. But he was also an architect of something else. In fact, he was the father of something else, and that was the nuclear program. And I think that there is absolutely no question that Mr. Bhutto, it was a civilian program that Mr. Bhutto masterminded, and within 2 weeks of coming into power, that was his compensation for the loss of Bangladesh. This was the only way to reintegrate Pakistan or reassert Pakistan into the international system. But what did that mean? It meant, I mean, first of all, sorting some things out. His crowning achievement was the Islamic summit in Lahore in February of 1974, which he used as a pretext to finally recognize Bangladesh. Because the interesting thing about Mr. Bhutto is that he, of course, was a Sindhi, a minority in Pakistan, and his main constituents were in Punjab. And the Punjabis were not mentally prepared to accept the reality of Bangladesh. And he, of course, negotiated the return of the 93,000 odd prisoners of war. But if you go through you just go to YouTube and see his speeches, where he's trying, you know, one of the ways in which politicians in our part of the world, or I suppose anywhere in the world, they throw an idea to see the reaction. So, I mean, he's doing exactly that. Should we accept them? Should we do it? And okay, fine, we won't do it. to hell with them, we won't accept, we won't do it. This is what he's doing. So he actually worked for a long time to get the people on his side. I mean, he is a master. I think Imran Khan is trying to do much the same, learn from Bhutto of how to get the people to think what he wants them to think. But Bhutto did it very well. He was a master craftsman there. But clearly, the bomb required money. And where was the money to come from? Well, it had to come from the newly enriched Arab states with their petrodollars. And of course, this was all taking place against the global assertion of Islam. So, you know, when we talk about Pakistan's peculiarities, the fact that it was doomed to be a sort of orthodox, conservative, violent state, we need to realize a couple of things here. Here is sort of a politician who can't really be credited with a very religious bent of mind, whatever that means. In this context, I mean, he was leaning towards the Arab world because he was trying to build a bomb. And what did that mean? I mean, that sort of emboldened his opponents in the religious, so-called religious, I say so-called because they are worldly political parties. I mean, these so-called religious ideologues who claim to be religious. And so they used the opportunity to get the Ahmadiyyas. It's a long-standing demand on their part. And Mr. Jinnah had resisted this initially as early as 1937. It was never brought to the. He never wanted this to happen. Ahmadis were very important in the Muslim League, played a very crucial role. But the movement against them again happened in '53. It was again shelved. The Pakistani state did not did not heed the demands of the religious right. It was only after the quadrupling of oil prices, the Arab-Israeli war, the global reassertion of Islam, with Saudi Arabia in the driving seat, that these elements found their means. And so Maududi, who was highly regarded Abul Ala Maududi, highly regarded in Saudi Arabia, his works were sort of distributed there, they succeeded in bringing pressure on Bhutto. And Mr. Bhutto's role, of course, I mean, he is the monster for most people, so he's again blamed for this, but we need to understand the context in which he did it. I know for a fact, and if you read Rafi Raza, his close aide in that period, he tells you that he was very agitated, and he says days before that, you know, you can't really compromise with these guys. You can't really compromise with these so-called religious guys. There's no end to it. You can't really do it, and yet he does it. And I know also from other sources that night when he did declare them non-Muslims, the Ahmadis, he felt that the Lahori party, which is different, I mean, some of you might not know that, but the Lahori party of Ahmadis do not actually agree with the Rabwa party. And I can elaborate that later, but he was very agitated because he said that if I don't declare these Lahoris also non-Muslims, they will be massacred. So he did that. So I think, I'm happy to explain that, but I won't. This is really what I want to point out, that this declaring Ahmadis non-Muslims has had an absolutely disastrous effect on a country that has been struggling to strengthen citizenship rights. By undermining the very idea of equal rights of citizenship, it has really created a nightmare for itself. But it began here for reasons that cannot be understood purely within the context of Pakistan. You need to look at a global level. And I think that's what I'm trying to say, that at every stage you cannot understand Pakistan without adequate reference to the global context. All right. So how transformative for Pakistan was the 11-year-long Zia regime, and in what ways? I think while bracing for another bout of military rule when Zia took over in July of 1977, nobody had quite imagined the extent of this man's rule, how long it would last, or for that matter, how much Pakistan would end up changing. in these 11 years. Nobody knew how long and certainly what this meant. But again, one needs to locate this Zia's so-called Islamization within a global context of what was going on at the time. And we do know that Zia's rule came to rival Ayyub's, which I haven't sort of elaborated on a great deal, but it's elaborated in the book, and Ayyub certainly has a lot of answering to do for 71. But this man also has a lot of answering to do with Pakistan's turn into, I would assert, from being even as late as the 70s, being a sort of quote-unquote moderate state, to becoming a sort of a hotbed of the most nefarious kinds of religious ideologies imaginable, which was really something, again, I would emphasize, done for strategic and political purposes and not for quote-unquote religious reasons. I think this is really crucial again. I think the misuse of religion in the case of South Asia in general and Pakistan in particular is a real problem. We don't know what we are talking about, but it becomes an easy cloak for lack of precision of analysis. So this man has a lot of answering to do. But I do want to share some part, sort of before I would like to share some part of this. Gone backward. Okay, let's keep him there. I want to talk about 1979. 1979 is, of course, best remembered for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution that preceded it. But what made it a pivotal year, and something that I want to refresh your memories on, were three spatially disconnected incidents in Tehran, in Mecca and Islamabad. Tehran, you all know. It was November 4th, 1979. Pro-Khomeini students stormed the American embassy and took several hostages. Mecca was the site of the second incident when, during the annual pilgrimage to Hajj on September 20th, 1979, the Kaaba, the holiest of the Muslim shrines, was attacked by 500 men led by Johaim al-Otaibi, a former Saudi National Guard. Now, the third attack, whilst this man was on a biking trip across Islamabad, he was biking around Islamabad while the embassy was burning. The attack on the American embassy in Islamabad was the third, carried out by the Jamiyat-e-Tulaba, the Jamaat-e-Islami, the party that supported him. He was having a bike ride around town. And while the embassy burned, the Pakistani paramilitary forces and police did nothing. There were helicopters, and it's just an extraordinary event. It's even more extraordinary because the Americans didn't really react very much and did not break relations, didn't make a big issue. But this is something that we can sort of revisit in discussion. Now, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, in December 1970, I do think that we need to keep that in mind. I mean, this was anti-Americanism in the making already in these three instances I've pointed out. And I mean, really, the so-called jihad in Afghanistan transformed Pakistan. I mean, it became it was really, this war against the Soviet Union was a veritable cash cow for Pakistan, gave a new lease of life to Zia's sagging political fortunes. But there was still, I mean, one of the points I've made throughout this book, that despite a long history of authoritarianism, resistance has always been built in. There have been people who have been asking this question, can Pakistan survive? Now, of course, people believe, when will it fail and when will it end? But the point here is that there's always been resistance in Pakistan, not to mention resilience. And it's important to account for those as well in order to really have an historical understanding of what's going on in this country. So I would like to say that in this man's dismal period, the dark night, as I call it, of the general, there were women who protested and resisted his Islamization policies with great resolve. And if anything, I think women in Pakistan owe General Zia a thanks for making them aware and bringing them out on the streets. I mean, I think this has made a big difference in terms of gender questions, and the women were in the vanguard of this opposition to him. I would like to say more. Seeking social and economic opportunities, not ideological lessons from a self-serving ruler, the democratic aspirations of Pakistan's disempowered found voice in Habib Jalib, the poet, the great sort of populist poet, and I'm sorry, I'll have to sort of give it in translation. Why should we fight America's war and color our land with blood? We are waiting light ourselves. Why should we throw stones on light? O tyrant, have you ever thought why all of God's creation is fed up with you? We are the forerunners of peace and freedom. Why should we become the accomplice of a usurper? Pakistanis from various walks of life, in addition to these women and ideological persuasions, vocalize their opposition to Zia, both at home and abroad. One London-based group, calling itself Pakistanis for Democracy, wrote a hard-hitting letter to the US Senator Frank Church, then the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, warning him of the hazards of granting military assistance to their country. Quote, Mr. Senator, you will pardon the people of Pakistan if they do not really perceive the threat to freedom by whatever the Russian troops may or may not be doing in Afghanistan. They know that their own freedom has been despoiled not by the Russian army, but by the gallant Pakistan army, on whose upkeep they have been squandering over 70% of their budget every year since the country attained independence. It was the army which would not let democracy take root in Pakistan. Under the present regime, the army as an institution was becoming an object of disdain. However, Zia was, of course, the primary target for his sanctimonious pose, palpable dishonesty, and untruthfulness. Any unconditional aid to General Zia and his regime would be planting a time bomb of instability in the region, which would be quite the opposite of what America wants and what the interests of America demand. These ominous words, I hardly need to say, have come back to haunt US policymakers over and over again in recent years. And so, Zia, of course, disappeared into ash. This, of course, resulted in the so-called restoration of democratic government. But of course, it was, one of the points that have to be emphasized is that it's always very difficult to make the transition from military authoritarian rule. In fact, Pakistan has been struggling since 1958 when the first coup took place. It's tried all manner of experiments and it's not really managed to make the transition. But it is often said that the years 88 to 99 represented a completely lost decade. I contest that notion quite severely. First of all, I think that we have to realize that the structural constraints, not to mention the Eighth Amendment, in which General Zia had written his name into the Constitution, it must be a sort of first to become permanent. He was permanent president of Pakistan. That was only taken out in the 18th Amendment recently in the last government. But the point here is that many other things happened in these years that need highlighting. The army chief, of course, Musharraf, who I want to talk about a little later, his success in 99 over Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who commanded a decisive majority in Parliament in October of 99, showed that the balance of power was still weightier on the side of the preeminent non-elected institution of the state, the army. Yet Pakistan under military rule in October of 99 under Musharraf was a different country from the one that Zia-ul-Haq had captured in July. And I think this needs to be really understood. Again, the kind of flattening out of Pakistan's history really doesn't do justice. The decade following Zia's death had seen the crystallization of crucial new political dynamics, an active judiciary, a struggling and of course compromised but vocal media, and a polarized but more conscious civil society that was altering the civil-military equations in important new ways. So I'm going to jump and we can come back, but I think this is what everybody wants to hear about. To what extent were the 2013 elections free and fair? They were as free and fair as the structural and existential realities of Pakistan permit. So let's not get ahead of ourselves here, as I think some people are. So long as there is all too close an interface between state officials and politicians, a completely free and fair election in Pakistan will remain an aspiration. The repeated interventions in military rule the sort of the fact that there has been a loss of institutional ethos on the part of the bureaucracies, that they look for political bosses, for the political masters in rather than seek institutional, rather than further the institutional ethos, they look for masters either with the party in power or the party in waiting. So the bureaucracy itself is partisan. I mean, you cannot expect the bureaucracy to be above. I think there's a false notion of what the state is in Pakistan. So I think this is conducted under this democratically utterly superfluous framework of caretaker governments to accommodate fears of partisanship by an incumbent government. The 2013 elections, nevertheless, are an important hallmark in the realization of that elusive object of free and fair elections. The endorsement of democracy in the face of Taliban terror by the largest voter turnout in 4 decades in Pakistan's history is perhaps the most encouraging sign of all. And I think, but at the same time, the voters also delivered a warning to the party that they were choosing, that if they didn't deliver, they would be voted out as well, and not only that they would protest and complain. I mean, this was a clear message. The rejection of the PPP was on the cards, but I think that any serious politician ought to have also taken note of the fact that this was a clear message to them, that their people expected delivery. They expect governance, not bickering and more bickering. They want their problems solved. Now, dubbing the outgoing ruling alliance secular, the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, formed in 2007 against the state, selectively targeted the coalition that was the outgoing coalition, the PPP, the Pakistan People's Party, the Awami National Party, the MQM, the Muttahida Qawmi Mahaz, as revenge. I mean, they were called secular, quote-unquote, parties, but as revenge for their support of the military operations in FATA and also in KPK, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. By contrast, the interesting thing about this election for me has been that the pro-Taliban parties, by which I mean those who advocated talking to the Taliban, namely the Pakistan Muslim League of Nawaz Sharif, Imran Khan's Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the JUF, the Jamiyat Ulema Islam, Fazlur Rahman, and not to mention the Jamaat-e-Islami, they were allowed to campaign freely in Punjab as well as the other 3 provinces that were awash with the blood of so-called secular parties. So I'm happy to sort of open this up. Am I within time?
Sure, yeah.
Just my last sort of point is, can Pakistan overcome terror? I think this is a really major question. The future course of democracy in Pakistan is obviously intrinsically linked with its capacity for overcoming terror, both conceptually and existentially. For all its litany of woes, and really they keep adding up, it seems, inflating, Pakistan is not going to disappear from the map of the world in any great hurry. I'm sorry to disappoint those who think that might be the case, or I'm happy to please those who hope that won't happen. Well, the innumerable challenges, internal, external, the situation has not really gone out of hand altogether. It's only that you sit here and see the idiot box and what they want to highlight and what you form your opinion. I think people need to visit Pakistan to see. Of course there are problems, but where are there not problems? I'd like to know. So I think that there's a huge problem of perception here. Power equations have changed in Pakistan, and Pakistan's state of martial rule is no longer in a position to exercise power without some combination of political parties to legitimize the arrangement. I mean, even military rulers need legitimacy. So the point is, then what? I mean, if you need legitimacy and you want to become politicians, that was the great sort of fallacy of Mr. Musharraf, that he wanted to be a politician and not be a dictator, and solve the problems, reform the country. But he didn't do that. He wanted to be a politician. Unlike the short-lived Arab Spring of 2012, there have been several Pakistani springs fired by the emotive force of regionalism, and that have all too easily been dismissed in the Pakistani context as secessionist and delegitimized in state-sponsored national narratives. If the political mainstream had accommodated these regional demands, not manipulated them to suit the purposes of incumbent governments, the curbs on the military and its capacity to come in would have been far more effective than they have proven to be. Another military intervention in Pakistan at a time when parts of the country are already in the control of insurgents and criminal militias, with links to serving and retired operatives of the state's intelligence agencies, can and will bring the whole edifice crumbling down. Confining itself to the role of ultimate arbiter, which has been the role the military has played, at least in the 88-99 period, may be the better part of valor for an army that has seen its prestige decline in direct proportion to the ground it has lost to civilian militias created by its own intelligence agencies. A constitutional change of government from one civilian government to another is a necessary but insufficient condition to bring about a decisive shift in civil-military relations in Pakistan. The army continues to shape foreign and defense policies and has the ultimate say in internal security matters. The ability to prevent a military coup does not imply civilian supremacy. It will take decades of an unbroken process of democratic politics, and also, I must add, some patience on the part of a very impatient electorate with their leaders. I mean, it's interesting that the narratives are so opposed to politicians in Pakistan that while there's a lot of patience with military rulers and their reforms, there was endless patience with Musharraf's reforms, I think, there's very little patience with politicians. The narratives end up going into a spiral of corruption narratives, arguments. So I think it will take decades. You cannot have a process where you can turn the tap on and turn the tap off. Have you ever tried turning the tap off and opening it after 2 years? It's very dirty. You need to let the water flow and keep it running. And so I think I'll end on that. It will take decades of unbroken democratic politics. The process, it's a process in which governments are voted in and out before the civilians can really begin to match the clout of the army. Until then, I really would just like to rest my case and say that the battle or the struggle for the soul of Pakistan is not over, and that the citizens of Jinnah's Muslim homeland still have a choice in the matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayesha. So I'll turn it over to Atiya.
Well, thanks, Ayesha. It was a provocative presentation. You call this a general book, but I think it is in some ways a culmination of your... Okay. Okay. Well, I was thanking Ayesha for her very provocative presentation, and it was interesting for me to hear her say that she calls this her general book, but the way I see it is that it's sort of a culmination of her earlier research and earlier work with some new archival evidence that she has used, especially to talk about 1971. And also the intent here is different. The intent here is, as she was emphasizing in her presentation, is to situate the story of Pakistan in a global context. And I think that changes one's understanding of what is happening in Pakistan and how must we or might we grapple with its past. So I have prepared my comments by way of some questions to you. Some of the predominant themes of the book that you have also touched on in your presentation right now. And what I was struck by, and I think I am in agreement with you, is that you do resist this simple identification between Islam and the conception of Pakistan by taking us back to the moment of Jinnah, who was firmly secular in his outlook, and a stance that he maintained even after the formation of Pakistan, and something he passed on to his immediate successor, Liaquat Ali Khan, who also espoused this liberal vision. And I like this quote, and I would like to read that from your book, because it kind of brings out this ambiguity that Islam has in Pakistan, or what it means. So I quote, "The country's first prime minister himself laid the basis for a measure of ambiguity by proclaiming Pakistan as a laboratory for an Islamic social order on the one hand, while also on the other calling for a truly liberal government that would permit the greatest amount of freedom. So it seems that since its inception, Pakistan has been caught in this tension between Islam and liberalism. And so my question really is that I wonder if this tension is a sign of melancholy of post-coloniality, expressing the failure of nationalist movements to secure democratic self-determination and economic independence in the aftermath of decolonization. I mean, it is not just a story of Pakistan, but it seems that in newly decolonized countries, there was this problem that religion became a problem in certain parts of the world. And liberalism itself posed itself as some kind of a very desiccated category, that it somehow came to be bound up with very retrogressive politics, that it kind of opened the way to, extremism or conservatism like religion, religious ideology. So for instance, if we're talking about Pakistan, leftists toyed with the idea of Islamic socialism. If conservatives talked about Islamic social order, liberals were kind of ambivalent. So it seems that it is sort of a problematic conception, a problematic idea, and kind of forces a certain kind of politics to play itself out in Pakistan. So,
well, I mean, I think that liberalism is problematic as it is understood. I mean, you haven't told me what you mean by liberalism. But if you're talking about liberalism in the colonial context, I think that the presumption that liberalism somehow originates in Europe. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of colonial liberalism or European liberalism, which is implicated in the project of empire, and therefore there are inherent problems there.
Yes, yes.
So the carryover into Pakistan. But let me just take this point about you're juxtaposing Islam versus. I think that's too simplistic. I think that we need to understand what we mean about Islam in Pakistan. Now, Islam, Pakistan was created not because there were disagreements on theocratic issues in India. This was a political movement. So when we say that Islam has always been has been a source of a problem, I mean, what is remarkable about Pakistan is that a non-issue was made an issue. Here is a country that is overwhelmingly Muslim. And why is it that Islam became a problem? It became a problem only because a centralizing state, an authoritarian state, wanted to use or invoke Islam to deny provincial diversity and the fact that Pakistan was effectively a federal configuration. So it wasn't anything in Islam or Islam versus liberalism. I don't think. I'd like to sort of ask you what you mean by liberalism. If by liberalism we mean a bent of mind that is open to others and is cosmopolitan, has a vision of freedom of the individual and property, I think those are quite compatible with Islam. So I don't really see. I mean, I know that people think that liberalism does not belong in Islam, and I'd like to sort of take them on, I think, next. But the point is that what I'm trying to say here is that it wasn't about liberalism. I mean, it was basically, I mean, even Liaquat. I mean, he was an immigrant politician who really, I mean, look what he did in 51. I mean, in Punjab, I mean, he moved bag and baggage to go and sort of rig the elections. That was the problem in Pakistan, not liberalism and Islam. I mean, the denial of basic democratic practices, even in this regard, because he was afraid that I mean, and you know that his death is largely attributed to the Punjabi onslaught. Certainly after this UP Urdu-speaking Prime Minister was assassinated, in circumstances that I opened the book with, really, with Benazir's assassination taking place in the exact same on the same garden, never found out what goes on. I mean, who's behind it was a Punjabi sort of thing. So I think that that's what I'm talking about. And I will say one more thing to you, that this notion about Pakistan's cultural identity being a serious, that Pakistan's never reconciled this cultural identity. I'll be very blunt with you, that Pakistanis are quite happy wearing several identities on their sleeves. They have no problem. The problem has been that of the state of Pakistan. The people of Pakistan are quite content being Sindhi being Muslim, being neighbors of Hindus. They're quite content being that. The problem of identity has been created by a state that has insisted on giving primacy to Islam without actually defining what this is meant to be, where its limits are, and what this entails. So I do think that we need to bring that in as well.
Sure.
But I don't know whether I've answered all your questions.
I think yes, you have. What I meant by liberalism was also in a global context that liberalism in the 20th century itself has been in crisis globally, as you were pointing out.
It had an earlier sort of, I mean, you know, there was a problem with liberalism in its very sort of conception.
Right. And I mean, I agree that I'm not arguing for, you know, that Pakistan was created in the name of Islam, but of course there was a certain politics.
Yeah, it was.
But it seems that because liberalism itself was at stake, and I mean globally, internationally, and the way it was inherited in the context of Pakistan kind of didn't actually help much. It sort of opened the door to these other conservative forces in which, you know, one can say or one may argue that Islam also kind of lurked behind. It was kind of always present.
Look, I mean, if you go to the Objectives Resolution of 1949, I mean, yes, I mean, it created space for the so-called guardians of Islam to constantly hold the government responsible for not ensuring that the citizens' lives were run according to Islam. That certainly happened, but you know, if you locate the Objectives Resolution in the context of the time, it was a victory for the so-called secular elements. Now, what does secularism mean in Pakistan? I mean, it doesn't mean a rejection of religion. I think this is another sort of main problem. And I mean, you know, the fact that every time you invoke secular in the Pakistani context, it gets translated as la diniyat, i.e. anti-religion. There is no such interpretation. It does not exist. The word for anti-religion is atheism. So the secular model here was accommodative, politically accommodative. So, I mean, I will return to that if anything, the liberal model you're talking about in reference to liaquat was that they wanted to provide citizenship to all and sundry, not make, that was the narrative of equal citizenship. You might say that given Pakistan's politics, peculiarities, the rights of equal citizenship were not conferred. And that was the crisis of liberalism insofar as this emerges from that. I would be happier with that than leaving it as liberalism.
Sure, right. So my second concern is the military because it's sort of the predominant theme of the book, and also it is the predominant theme of Pakistan's history. But if the argument vis-a-vis Islam is that of ambiguity, I wonder if one can also argue about ambivalence towards the military. Now, Ayub Khan was the first military dictator. He was seen as the modernizer. He was the modernizer. The state development project changed the country. It kind of integrated Pakistan into the global economic system. In that sense, he was admired. But then he was also loathed, he was hated, and so finally deposed. I think with the exception of Ziaul Haq, Musharraf was also seen as some kind of enlightened moderator, enlightened secular despot, if you will. And so it seems that in Pakistan, and sort of also coming from Pakistan and speaking to people there is a certain fascination with, you know, the strong man or the strong leader. And it seems, I mean, I understand in your narrative and in your argument, you give immense and abundant sort of evidence how the military was constituted as a result of geopolitical factors, and kind of it became this formidable institution that kind of, you know, now controls, and it's like part of the economy of society. It sort of permeates every social aspect of Pakistan. But also, to what extent is this institution also socially produced, in the sense that what is its appeal to the masses. You know, they have this ambivalence toward, they love the leader, they hate the leader, they're ambivalent about the leader.
You know, I would contest your presumption that the Pakistani Awam or want military dictatorship. I do accept that there are self-serving elements in Pakistan who find it easier to work with a military ruler as opposed to politicians. But I really don't think, I think the really interesting thing to begin with is this Pakistanis are awaiting for the strong man to relieve them. I think the whole problem with Pakistan is that, before we get to the military, is that there's no understanding of process, that things require process, that it's not about, you know, I mean, everybody, they're still awaiting for the Messiah to arrive. The latest Messiah is, of course, sitting in outside Parliament in the, you know, and has been very resolute. But I mean, it just shows that, I mean, and he is getting support because people think that he can solve it. Nobody has thought about the magnitude of the problem. I mean, so yes, I think maybe the attraction partly for those who support the military is that you get a strong, I mean, I might add that the Americans also like the Pakistani strong men. I mean, let's put it quite bluntly here. And they've played a major role in that regard. I can't sort of resist this.
Yes.
But in terms of the narrative about the popular narrative about the military as the answer, you're suggesting that that's really the dominant. I don't agree with that. I do think that the question to be asked, the salient question to be asked is how this military emerged dominant and what its dominance has cost the other institutions of Pakistan. I think that's the question that has to be asked. So when you put it in those terms, then I think you begin to realize that one of the reasons why there is such a negative narrative and perception of politicians, and I'm not even getting into the structural difficulties of a military-dominated state to create a transition. I think that's what I am trying to emphasize, that it's not easy to move out of military dominance, that the military has been self-perpetuating. But I will make one very important comment here, that when I speak of the military dominance, it is really, we have to understand what we are saying. It's not the whole institution that is really benefiting. It's a handful of, I mean, you know, it begins with the men. It's Ayub and a coterie of people, then Zia, and I mean a small group of people, Musharraf, and the whole institution's implication here is perhaps misconstrued. It's really and the point is the military's involvement in politics, not the military's involvement in managing the borders or securing or providing internal security. That's not in question. The question is the impulse to intervene. And why do these people intervene, and to what effect? I mean, has it really benefited the military as a whole? There has always been a debate, and I would like to see anybody challenge me on that, that whichever period you live in go to Pakistan's history, there's always been a debate within the officer corps whether direct intervention in politics is the best way for military professionalism. It's not that these debates have not been there. I mean, if you read the memoirs, and they have been in abundance published, this has been the critique. The decline in professional standards. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that we all know that in the Pakistan army, you know, up to colonel is fine, and then it's all political. So the moment you become brigadier, that's a political decision. But I would go even further to the generals, the top core people who have taken these decisions. All the coups in Pakistan have been at the highest level. This is a post-colonial military. And it's not independent, it didn't fight a war of independence. So there is that ethos. It's still a very top-down thing. So the decisions have been taken by a handful. It has meant, they've taken them on behalf of the army, but even under martial law, only a very small percentage directly engages in martial law duties. And that resentment for those who are in martial law duties and those who are not is there. But being a strong institution with a very strong social ethos, they don't contest this, but if you can hear them, we've always heard them.
Yeah, so you end on a note of optimism. You seem to have some faith, or you're very optimistic about certain modes of resistance that have emerged. I mean, albeit they are marked by a certain failure, but you seem very optimistic about certain expressions of resistance in art, literature, poetry, and I think it has always been there in Pakistan. But given the situation or the scenario in which this uncontestable political power that controls the country, how do you think these forms or modes of resistance can challenge or can overcome the difficulty of sort of fracturing?
Well, I mean, you saw it yourself in 2007 when Mr. Musharraf overplayed his hand and you saw the lawyers' movement. Now, I have lots to say about that. But I do think that the new social media, which I think is very, very sort of problematic as well, but there is new technology that has enabled long-suffering people to begin to question authoritarianism. I really don't think that Pakistanis prefer authoritarianism to democracy. And I think that's, I mean, or the military. There are some individuals, of course, who have, for reasons of their own, want the military in. I don't deny that. But this has been an ongoing contest. And if you look at your parliamentarians, I think, I mean, you know, there'll be some who'll say, well, they're self-serving. But I mean, you know, if you do away with parliament, where else are you going to go? They don't want the military to come in. Why has the parliament stood up to Imran's, you know, I mean, this constant barrage of election? They've all, for the first time in Pakistan's history, they've come together and said that we will not have this. There's a process has to take place. So I think that what has been wrong with Pakistan is this, again, the kind of spirit where you can, at a stroke of the you know, of the pen, change the system. What is it? What is the constitution? You tear apart. I mean, you know, every society disagrees. The problem with Pakistanis is that their disagreement always entails dismantling whatever is there. I mean, they cannot agree on a system. So my point is that you have to agree on a system and then fight within it.
Yeah.
But if you're going to constantly undermine the very system, then that's not going to work. So I would say that the narrative has to sort of be one where, I mean, democracy is conflict, excuse me.
Yeah.
I don't know what Pakistanis think it is. Democracy is to, and what you need to do as a civilized society is to manage that conflict. And for that you need institutions. You cannot stand out, tomorrow all of us can stand out and say that this election is unfair. We can never agree. So we need, you know, I mean, if the election, I mean, the elections have been rigged in the past as well, let's see the evidence and let's deal with it. But to sort of rubbish the entire system is a bit much. This is what I think that I have seen some evidence now. I believe that democracy, the first principle of democracy is to know the limitations of your power. The politicians have started demonstrating that for some time. There's a long struggle. This is not going to happen tomorrow. So when you say I'm optimistic, you know, one of the great problems with Pakistan is that the Pakistanis genuinely believe that they don't have a future. And so the world, I mean, you know, the point is that if you, I mean, so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, just because you have problems, if you say they cannot be resolved, nobody's going to do anything, nobody's going to take the responsibility, then yes. But I think that has to change. And if they are not prepared to accept that they're, I mean, obviously it's not easy. I think I have detailed it in a very nuanced way that even a successful, a fairly effective government may not be effective enough. But there has to be patience. You have to let the process go. I mean, there will have to be lots of difficulties, but that will, so I mean, I'm not optimist. I mean, it's not a question of optimism triumphing over experience. It is sort of nuanced in the sense that I think that if they don't see, I mean, I really don't think Pakistanis can afford to stop hoping.
Yeah.
But I think the danger is, I mean, I met somebody in Canada, in Toronto, who said, you know, who's a Canadian, who's a development worker, and he said that's the whole problem. And you say, you know, somebody go and tell them that they're not a failed state.
Well, we'll open it up now.
Yeah. So just as a reminder that wait for the microphone to come by, and so we'll start here. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jalal, for your presentation. My name is Malik Siraj Akbar. I'm a mid-career student at the Kennedy School. See, while talking about Pakistan, scholars like you, historians like you, or Professor Akbar Ahmed seem to have a romantic, you know, understanding of Jinnah. And I just wonder, like, besides the August 11, 1947 speech of Jinnah, was he ever secular? You know, going back to 1940 in the Lahore resolution speech, he was absolutely communal. You know, or going back to Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, you know, all the leaders of Pakistan movement have clearly had contempt for the Hindus. Whether it's Sir Syed Ahmad Khan or Jinnah, they clearly said like we are two different nations. And then Pakistani ideology itself is centered based on anti-Indianism or just Islamic identity. Jinnah went to Dhaka, imposed or said Pakistan's national language would be Urdu. So I just wonder, I think a lot of problems in Pakistan were created by Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan. The objective resolution primarily said Pakistan, the sovereignty would lie with Allah. So the constitution, the parliament would never ever question any of the existing laws. So when scholars, romanticize Jinnah, I just wonder, like, what was the phase? Do you see like Jinnah transforming from being the leader of 1947, 40 to 1947? What were like some other speeches that he ever made that he was secular? Thank you.
But I mean, I don't understand what your definition of secular is. I
My
just made a point that you're
I would
suggesting
say
that
like
secularism is somehow opposed to religion.
No, separation, like, individuals should not be judged on their religion. In Pakistan,
So
for
who's
example,
judging who on religion?
well, like, the Pakistan's only Nobel Prize winner, Abdus Salam, is somewhat officially disowned. If you are an Ahmadi,
But Mr. Jinnah did not disown the Ahmadis.
Well,
Mr.
he-
Bhutto continued to work. I've just gone through explaining that. I think you are the one who's already formed your opinion, and I certainly have no romantic view of Jinnah. I did what was needed to
No, but what I'm
explain
saying
his
is
politics.
Jinnah always
if you
wanted-
but you've made up your mind that he is
But
a
I'm
communal.
I'm giving you examples, right? If you could defend your argument with instances, that's what I'm saying.
No, I have
Besides
written
August
so much
11
more.
speech,
You are the one who needs to defend your argument. I have
besides
written so
August
much
11
on this
speech,
subject.
can you give me
Okay,
second
yeah.
example
This
that
is-
Jinnah
Yeah.
was ever secular?
All right.
No, but
Jinnah
I-
was communal, right?
So,
No, I'm sorry, what is communal?
Communal was that he clearly divided people based on religion. He had
I
contempt
don't
for the
think you have
Hindus.
it right, actually. I'm
Pakistan
sorry,
had a
it's-
huge
Yeah.
Hindu population in Lahore, and everyone was compelled to go back.
So
I think-
yeah,
I
I
think-
think,
I think
yeah,
we'll
I
just
think
leave
we'll
that.
just move on to the next question. But I do think that in terms of Jinnah, especially with the creation of Pakistan, he was very clear that Pakistan was a nation for all religions. Whether you were Hindu or Christian or whatever you were. He didn't have this that it was just a nation for Muslims. So anyway, we'll move on. We have a question back there, and then.
Assalamu alaikum. I'll just clarify your point also. Jinnah was a secular person, and secular means somebody who, as gentleman said, welcomes other religion and give respect and rights to like Hindus and Christians, and not enforce Islam on everybody that you have to follow Islam. You follow Islam by your choice. That's secularism.
Okay.
What-
No, no.
have an un-Muslim president or prime minister in Pakistan?
I'm not. That's a different point. Secularism doesn't mean that you have somebody else, a Muslim or a non-Muslim religion. But secularism mean, like in Turkey, is that you allow other people, like you don't go by sects, and you don't go by other religion, and everybody has a right to live their life. In a safe and secure manner. But as far as the election and voting is concerned, every country has their own rules.
Yeah.
I cannot be the president of United States because I'm not born over here, but I'm American national. So every country has their own rules, but that doesn't mean you're secular or you're not secular. I'm just giving a definition of secular.
Okay, so do you have a question for Professor Jalal?
I was
No,
just
he
wanting
doesn't
All
have
to
a
right.
question.
Okay. All right. So who else has a question? Yeah. Okay. Here.
Thank you very much. So a lot of your work and students who are graduate students who are looking at Pakistan are very inspired by your work, has been critical of or not so much critical, but like you said, very nuanced understanding of the politics, the larger politics versus of the creation of Pakistan and what has transpired since then, versus the narrative that we growing up in Pakistan heard. In this latest book of yours, it seems that you are taking more of this is the kind of book that you would see on the shelves in Pakistan, as opposed to some of your other books that have been rejected by people who want a particular narrative, a very military protective narrative in Pakistan. So, as an academic, as a researcher, as a historian, how would you explain this sort of shift in your sort of analysis? I haven't.
Have you read my book?
No, no.
What shift in analysis are you referring to?
So there is similarity definitely that your discussion of the military, for instance, is very much consistent, and
So what's different?
the optimism, for instance.
No, I think that the optimism is totally being I mean, you know, because you become so used to totally negative, pejorative narratives on Pakistan that anybody who comes and says, well, look at the larger picture. Don't just focus on your hobby horses. When you open up the picture, it is much more complex.
Right.
I mean, you know, people have this vision of Pakistan as a combat zone. I mean, every time I'm going to the US, leave the US, everybody says, be safe. Why are you going? Be safe. You know, I mean, the point is that, you know, fine, it's not safe, but I mean, you can be in the wrong place at the wrong time, of course. I'm not saying that. But the fact is that there is a lot going on there that simply doesn't get read, understood, digested. So I would completely say that this book is consistent with my work. I have never disowned my work. To say that this book will be on the shelves of people in Pakistan, well, so are the others. They just will never read them. Yes, like the other books have never been read. So the point is that what is different is that in this book I have brought the narrative to the present, or as much as I could. That's the only thing that's different. Yeah. But there is no change here in terms of what I've, my earlier research. It is a synthesis. And it's a political narrative which brings in the cultural. But I think the demand was for a political narrative. People felt that there was a need for a political narrative of Pakistan, and so be it. I've done my job. It took me a long time to come around to doing it.
And we're grateful for
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, you know, it's now your job to take it further.
All right. Do we have any?
Yes, I hope that historians will improve on it. Yes.
I've got a loud voice.
You should know that.
So thank you for your talk, and especially the stuff you said about Bhutto and contextualizing the Ahmadiyya issue. My question to you is that considering all of that happened on his watch, whatever the watch, however you define the watch, and we all know what transpired, in your opinion, with hindsight, do you think he could have done things differently, even as we know that what you said, that it's difficult to compromise with the religious right or all those fellows? Given all the context that you know so well, could there have been a better way to handle that issue or that crisis?
I mean, you know, that's a counterfactual, but yes, I do think there could be, could have been a better resolution. I also think that there is need for a deep study, and I hope that I see so many students here, that somebody will sit and read the National Assembly proceedings that are now available to see what actually happened. I understand that there was a sense that the leadership of the Ahmadi community also didn't handle the case as well as it could have. So I do think that there were other alternatives.
For him?
Yes, yes, of course. And for Pakistan as a result, I think, as well.
Thank you so much. My name is Beena Sarwar. I'm a journalist based in Cambridge now. I really enjoyed your talk, and I look forward to actually reading the book. And a lot of what you say, it really resonates with my own ideas, and that's one of the reasons I like what you say so much, but I guess. But I have a question about, further. I mean, as like you talked about the Ahmadi thing, you talked about what Zia-ul-Haq and all of that, the objective resolution. We've had what we call right now one of the biggest issues facing Pakistan, and I don't know how that is going to get resolved, and I wonder if you have any ideas on that, which is the so-called blasphemy law. You heard this case of this pop singer turned mullah who said some ridiculous things. Yes, there's an FIR against him. So there is now an FIR, charging him with so-called blasphemy under 295C, which
blasphemy against women for sure.
I agree, and I know many women who say they will throw a shoe at him when they next see him, whether or not he is. But I believe he's had to flee the country. He has apologized, but and obviously, many of us will stand up and say that case against him is wrong, even though he's one of the lobby that would have supported such cases against other people. But that is really something that's happening right now in Pakistan. anything that anybody says or does, you charge them with blasphemy, and they either have to flee the country, or they are imprisoned, or they are killed.
So clearly
what's
it
the
has nothing to
resolution?
do with blasphemy at all.
Right.
It has to do with politics again. I mean, so
Absolutely.
localized politics, you want to either grab somebody's property or sort of, you know, so that's what's going on. And I mean, we need to, we need to look at the history of the blasphemy law and what Pakistan has done with it. But if you look at the localized instances of cases on blasphemy, I mean, there were none prior to the blasphemy law, and they have increased in you know, disproportionately.
Nobody ever got killed for it before.
No, no,
But so my question is, do you see a resolution of this in the political system?
The parliamentarians, you know, they have to take a lead in this. I'm not a politician. I mean, you know, that's what has to be debated and discussed. But why? I mean, you know, one of the great problems in Pakistan has been the willingness to allow liminal spaces. I mean, to not address, not take responsibility for certain issues and let them just sort of slide, with the result that there has been greater appropriation by those who are bigoted for political reasons. I mean, even bigotry is actually meant to sort of achieve a political end. I mean, you are actually sort of targeting someone, you have a reason. So I think that until the politicians do so, but you have to prepare the ground for people to really understand. I mean, nobody wants to insult the Prophet or his companions, or, you know, but the point here is that that is not the real issue here. The fact is what is being done with the law that claims to be preventing blasphemy, but really was instituted by the colonial state to prevent. I mean, it was a protection against people's religious sensibilities, so that they were not sort of insulted. That's all it was.
Do you think the parliamentarian solution will actually trickle down into the?
No, they have. It has to be a dialogue. You have to sort of explain to people what's going on. But ultimately, this is a matter for Parliament to deal with. It's a matter that Parliament has to legislate, but it cannot be legislated upon without creating the space for it. Right. So it is but I mean, parliamentarians. They are your politicians. They are your leaders. They have to take up the matter and see that it's. I mean, and people are trying, but there is a tendency to sort of evade this issue because everybody is scared of getting killed.
All right. Thank you.
Ayesha, thank you very much. And I actually would just like to comment on what you have said as somebody who lives in Pakistan and works in Pakistan for the betterment of Pakistan. And very often people like us feel, I take care of an organization by name of SPELT, which is doing something for teaching teachers how to teach English better.
And to spell as well.
Okay? Yeah. Yeah. And we've been there for 30 years. There are many other such organizations. And one of the things that we feel very sad about is that whatever things that are done, which are positive, like you say, they are never anywhere in a Western press. So I just endorse your view that it's a lot to do with the global politics. And very often I feel, in fact, I've been thinking, if Pakistan was not in this geopolitical situation where, you know, it is situated and was somewhere like in a corner someplace, the people in Pakistan are wonderful, they are talented, and we would have survived very well.
Yeah.
Well, I won't say anything. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
So we'll have one last question here. Yeah.
So I haven't read the book either, but I'm looking forward to reading it now that I've heard your talk. I'm really excited that you have a positive view on the future of Pakistan. I am also a Pakistani, but I've been living here.
If I may stop you here, you know, what I have said is that it is up to the people of Pakistan still to say that I am optimistic. I mean, first the people of Pakistan have to decide. But, you know, what I will say is that the resilience of the people is extraordinary. I will also say that those who talk about the so-called liberals of Pakistan getting in a plane and leaving, don't realize that there are millions who can never leave.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is what gives me hope. You should see Pakistanis are desperate to do something good for their country.
Yeah.
And I think that that is just ignored here.
So my question
Sorry,
is...
I just wanted to, not that I am optimistic, I mean, you know, it's the people of Pakistan.
And that's good to hear. My question is, where do you start? There are so many problems in the government. There's corruption, as we learned in our South Asia class, which Professor Khanna here teaches. There is a lot of problems within the government, so it's not functioning well. How do regular people start? How do we start solving this problem? Do you delineate any steps that we can take? How can we make the process better? What can we do?
There are multiple levels. I mean, the point is that I would sort of foreground a couple of things. I would foreground the administration, the bureaucracy. I think the Pakistani bureaucracy still has ability. It's still, if it is allowed to function. I mean, I think the bureaucracy needs a lot of reform, a lot of attention. It requires, Bhutto is accused of having instituted a policy of taking away the immunity of the bureaucrats. They had immunity until '73, which he took away, and that is seen as the reason for this partisanship that the bureaucracy has shown above its institutional ethos. So the fragmentation of the Pakistani state, a state that has tried to centralize, is precisely the fact that there is personalized rule. There was always personalized rule, but it is now enhanced. So there is no delivery. I mean, you can make laws, you can make policies, but they don't get implemented, right? Yeah. So you need the bureaucracy. And so Mian Nawaz Sharif, I mean, he's a Mughal Shahenshah. I mean, in the sense that his style is that he has a few favorites, but he doesn't let the bureaucracy function. So I think that the people of Pakistan want delivery. And I'll give you an example. The example stems from the fact that in areas where you wouldn't expect the state to even matter to people. Let's take Balochistan. The evidence coming from young people, again, why I'm hopeful who are doing the research, suggests that even though the delivery is inadequate, people are still taking their petitions and their complaints to the government office. They are not looking for non-state actors to do their job, as people would like to believe. They are going to the government. They're also, so the bureaucracy is important. If you look at the assertion of state authority, whether it's NADRA, whether it's the database, I mean, so they are happening, things are happening. I do think that over a period of time, the bigger problem, I do think that there are huge problems, I wouldn't deny that, but the bigger problem has also become one of will, the lack of will to do things. People in Pakistan have become so atomized by this kind of a culture that nobody wants to take responsibility. I see this at certain institutions that I have happened to observe in Pakistan, that nobody really wants, they're all microcosms of Pakistan. Nobody really wants to take responsibility. Nobody wants to have a good idea at a meeting because that'll mean you'll have to do the job. So people go, so this kind of disassociative behavior is also a result of a very unfortunate political evolution. So I think that when you say there's so many areas, every Pakistani, rather than looking for the Messiah who is going to come, they should stop waiting for the Messiah and get on with the issue in their small way. It's a multi-pronged problem. And Pakistanis have to learn to work in processes, not in terms of things and democracy is bad. Democracy is a process. Corruption, you talk about corruption. Which country doesn't have corruption? But countries have mechanisms to deal with them, accountability. The bureaucracy needs institutional accountability within. It should be within the administration, within the bureaucracy. So I think that this is what I would say is wrong. But to simply say that I've become optimistic, I mean, why the hell should I sort of be optimistic if I didn't think that the perspective is wrong? If we focus, and let me just say one final thing on the military as well. It doesn't make, in this age, post-Cold War era, it doesn't pay for the military to want to come in. Pakistan is a very difficult country to run. Why should the military want to take over a country like this? It won't help it with the international patrons, such as Pakistan has left. It is a matter of people beginning to take the responsibility and agreeing on processes. Yes, the military would like to keep the politicians in their place. That's another matter. And some politicians have greatly enhanced and helped that process all through. So the problem is that your politicians look to the military. I mean, that's basically what's happened. The politicians of Pakistan look to the military because that's the easy way. And everybody wants to be parachuted into office. Nobody wants to wait their turn and do work. That's basically the problem. Once everybody realizes that nothing is going to change overnight, Now the great big hope is Imran Khan, who's going to change everything in what, 90 days or 9 days? What does it become now? Or is it 90 seconds? So I mean, the point is that so everybody thinks it's going to happen, and when you say, well, you know, he's surrounded by the same people that he says he's going to, you know, he's going to remove corruption. How is he going to remove corruption? Well, they say, well, you know, he'll be okay. He will be okay, and then everything will be fine. So what about systemic corruption? So I think that the problem is massive. I also think that the main issue has been this liminal concession that has been made of areas, swaths of territory have been allowed to fall into the hands of other people because the institutions of the state have not wanted to take the responsibility. Balochistan is an example. FATA has been a historic example. So I do think that you have to realize what has been going on and the reasons for that. And I mean, I hope you will read the book. I tried my best to explain. And I mean, there are 101 dissertations to be written yet about Pakistan.
All right. So I think with that, all right. So just wanted to, at the end, well, first of all, to thank Ayesha for coming and talking about her book. I think one of the important things, you know, that her work shows, and which sort of intersects in ways with my work, even though I do very different type of work, is really questioning really the role of religion. Because, you know, people tend to think like religions have agencies, like religions are like people and they have agency, and they don't. Religions are, you know, culturally constructed phenomena, and they're in political, economic, social contexts. And very often, people are not able to separate, you know, what can be religious symbols and actually looking into, well, how are religious ideas being instrumentalized by basically different contexts. So that, I think, in her analysis of Pakistan, what Ayesha does brilliantly is really question the tendency to use religion as the dominant lens of analysis, and which I think what Amartya Sen actually points out very beautifully in his book, that focusing on just using that one lens creates a haziness of vision. And what I think what she does is actually says, no, we need to clarify what the vision is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's very apt.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so just for those of you who'd like to buy a copy of the book, there is outside, there's a table with the books. There's also reception outside, so please help yourself. And Ayesha will still be around, so if you have any questions and things, please. Thank you.
I have a funny story about Ben.
All right, thank you.
And Benjamin Browder. I teach at Boston College.